She held her mother's hand for 9 days, and on the 9th night, the fingers went loose. Just like that. No last words. No goodbye. Just a woman looking at her daughter one final time. The way you look at someone you love when you know you are about to leave them behind forever. And then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't go away when morning comes. Alara Voss was 14 years old, and she was now completely alone in the world. My amazing friends and family, welcome back to Jenna's Velvet Tales. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe. Every subscription helps us share more emotional stories. If this kind of story touches you, your support truly means a lot. Feel free to say where you're watching from, and don't forget to explore more beautiful stories here on the channel. Now back to the story. Let me take you back to where it all began. Briarton was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew your name but nobody really knew your story. It sat at the edge of the kingdom, far from the capital, far from anything that mattered to the people who made decisions. The houses were simple, built from stone and wood, and the streets were narrow and quiet. Soldiers from the local garrison marched through every morning on their way to the training grounds, their boots hitting the cobblestones in a steady rhythm that Alara had memorized before she even learned to read. Her mother, Sarah Voss, ran a small sewing shop on the main road. She mended uniforms for the garrison, took in winter coats, and patched trousers for the farmers who came into town on market days. Behind the cottage, she kept a garden where she grew rosemary and wild mint, and the smell of those herbs would drift through the kitchen window on warm evenings and fill the whole house with something that felt safe. That was the life everyone in Briarton saw. A quiet seamstress, a kind woman, a good mother raising her daughter alone. But Alara knew there was more, because she had watched her mother at night when she was supposed to be asleep. She would creep down the hallway in bare feet and stand just outside the kitchen doorway, pressing herself against the wall so the floorboards wouldn't creak. And from there, she could see Sarah sitting by the fire, holding something small in her hands. It was a pendant, made of iron, dark and scratched, shaped like a tiny shield. Sarah would turn it over and over between her fingers, slowly, like she was reading something written on its surface that only she could understand. Sometimes her lips moved, but no sound came out. Sometimes her eyes would get wet, but she never actually cried. She just sat there, holding that pendant, staring into the fire like she was looking at something 1,000 miles away. Alara watched this happen night after night, for years, and she never said a word about it. She didn't want to intrude on whatever her mother was carrying, because even as a child, she could tell it was something heavy, something private, something that lived deep inside Sarah like a second heartbeat. But one night, when Alara was 12, she couldn't hold the question any longer. She stepped into the kitchen, and Sarah looked up, startled, her thumb still pressed against the grooves of the pendant. "Mama," Alara said softly. "What is that?" Sarah stared at her for a long moment. Her eyes were wet again, but this time it was different. This time, the wetness seemed to spill from a place so deep that Sarah couldn't hold it back even if she tried. She took a slow breath, set the pendant on her knee, and said, "Sit down, sweetheart. There is something I need to tell you." And so Sarah told her everything. 20 years before Alara was born, a border conflict had nearly torn the kingdom apart. Enemy forces had pushed deep into the northern territories, and the royal army was stretched thin and desperate. They needed messengers, people who could move fast and quiet through enemy-held land, carrying orders and medical supplies between outposts that had been cut off from the main force. It was dangerous work. Most of the messengers who went out did not come back. Sarah volunteered. She was young then, barely 20, strong and quick and full of the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply shows up when it's needed. Because women were not allowed to serve, she cut her hair short, bound her chest with cloth, and used a man's name. She crossed enemy lines 14 times in 3 months. She carried sealed orders tucked inside her boots. She carried small pouches of medicine strapped against her ribs under her shirt. And one night, during a heavy storm, she carried a wounded captain on her back through a flooded ravine while the water rose past her waist, and the current tried to pull them both under. She saved 11 men that night. 11 soldiers who would have died in that ravine if she hadn't come back for them. One by one, trip after trip, until her legs could barely hold her and her hands were shaking so badly she could hardly grip the rocks. When the conflict finally ended, Sarah expected nothing grand in return. Maybe a simple thank you, maybe her real name written down on a list somewhere, even if nobody ever read it. Instead, she got silence. Her commanding officer sat her down in a tent and told her that acknowledging a woman had served in combat would be, in his words, complicated. They gave her a small pension, enough to live on but not enough to mean anything. They told her to go home, and they asked her, firmly and clearly, never to speak of what she had done. So Sarah went home. She opened a sewing shop. She grew her garden. She raised her daughter. And she never spoke about the border conflict to anyone in Briarton. Not to the neighbors, not to the garrison officers whose uniforms she mended, not to the old women who brought her bread and gossip on Sunday mornings. But she spoke about it to Alara. That night by the fire, with the pendant resting on her knee and the flames throwing soft shadows across her face. She told her daughter every detail. The cold. The fear that tasted like iron in your mouth. The sound of water rushing through the ravine in the dark. The weight of a grown man on her back when her own body had nothing left to give. And the silence afterward, the enormous, suffocating silence of being told that the bravest thing you ever did simply didn't happen. They can take your name off a list, Sarah said, and her voice was steady but thin, like thread pulled too tight. They can pretend you were never there, but they cannot take what you did out of your bones, Alara. It lives in you, and someday, it will live in someone else. She picked up the pendant and pressed it gently into Alara's palm. The iron was warm from being held so long. Keep this, Sarah said, and if you ever get the chance to stand where I stood, don't let them erase you too. Alara closed her fingers around the pendant and felt its weight settle into her hand like a small, quiet promise. 2 years later, that promise became the only thing she had left. The fever came in winter the way bad things often do, hiding behind the cold. Started as a cough, nothing that worried anyone at first. Sarah waved it off and kept working, kept sewing, kept tending her garden even when the frost made her fingers stiff. But the cough got worse. It settled deep in her chest, and within a week, she couldn't get out of bed. Alara called for the town doctor, an old man with kind eyes and not enough medicine, and he did what he could, which wasn't much. He told Alara to keep her mother warm, give her broth, and hope for the best. Alara did more than hope. She sat beside Sarah's bed every single day, from morning until long past midnight. She boiled broth and carried it carefully to the bedside, and when it went cold because Sarah couldn't drink it, she boiled more. She read aloud from the books Sarah loved, stories about faraway places and brave people and happy endings. And she kept reading even when Sarah's eyes stopped following the words and drifted toward the window, toward something only she could see. She held her mother's hand, that familiar hand, rough from years of needlework but still warm, still strong enough to squeeze back. For 9 days this was her world. The bed, the broth, the books, the hand. On the 9th night Sarah opened her eyes. It was late, and the fire had burned down to coals, and the room was lit by a single candle on the bedside table. Alara was sitting right there, the way she always was, holding her mother's hand with both of hers. Sarah looked at her, and even though she was weak, even though her body was failing, her eyes were completely clear. She looked at Alara the way you look at someone when you want to memorize every detail of their face because you know you're about to go somewhere you can't bring them. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything she needed to say was in that look, and Alara understood all of it. Then Sarah's fingers went loose. Slowly, gently, like she was letting go of something she had been holding onto for a very long time. And the room became so quiet that Alara could hear the candle flame moving in the still air. She sat there for hours afterward, still holding her mother's hand even though it had gone cold. The tears didn't come right away. They came later over the following weeks, in waves that hit at the strangest moments. While peeling potatoes for a dinner she would eat alone. While folding one of Sarah's old shirts and pressing it against her face to catch the last trace of her scent. While standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, listening to the soldiers' boots marching past the way they always did, steady and indifferent, as if the world hadn't just lost someone who mattered. She was 14 years old. The sewing shop was hers now. The garden was hers. The cottage with its creaky floors and its cold kitchen and its empty chair by the fire was hers. All of it was hers, and none of it felt like enough to fill the space her mother had left behind. But the pendant was hers too. And every night, after the shop was closed and the dishes were washed and the doors were locked, Alara sat by the fire and held it the way Sarah used to. She turned it over between her fingers. She pressed her thumb into the grooves. And she felt the same thought rise up inside her chest, pressing against her ribs like something alive, something that wanted out. Promised. 6 years passed. Alara grew up in that cottage the way a tree grows through a crack in stone, slowly and stubbornly, shaped by the pressure around it. She ran the sewing shop, mending the same garrison uniforms her mother had mended, pressing the same winter coats, serving the same customers who came through the door with polite smiles and small talk about the weather. The townspeople were kind to her. They brought bread and checked on her and told her she was doing well, and they meant it. But none of them knew what she carried inside. None of them knew about the pendant or the promise or the fire that burned behind her ribs every single night when she sat alone in that kitchen. At 20 years old, she finally did something about it. She sat down at the kitchen table on a cold evening, pulled out a sheet of paper, dipped her pen in ink, and wrote her name on an application to the Royal Guard Academy. Her hand was shaking, not from fear but from the sheer weight of what she was doing. She knew that once she sent this letter, her quiet life in Briarton was over. There would be no coming back to this table, this kitchen, this safe and simple existence. She folded the paper 3 times. She unfolded it. She folded it again. And then, before she could change her mind, she sealed it and walked it to the post office and handed it over. The acceptance letter arrived 6 weeks later. It was short and formal and cold, just a few lines telling her where to report and when. She read it standing in the doorway of the cottage, morning light falling across the page, and she felt her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Ashimere Fortress was everything Briarton was not. It sat on a gray hill above a gray river, a massive structure of stone and iron that seemed designed for one purpose, to make every person who walked through its gates feel small. The courtyard was wide and open, paved with stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of marching boots, and the wind blew across it without anything to stop it, cutting through coats and skin and settling into your bones. On the first morning, 60 recruits stood in rows in that courtyard. They were tall, broad, young men who had trained for this moment since they were boys. And then there was Alara, 5'6", thin wrists, a crease on her application form where she had folded it too many times. She could feel the cold through her coat, but she could feel something else even more, the eyes. Dozens of them, staring at her from every direction. The drill sergeant was a thick, hard man named Brannock, with a voice that sounded like gravel being dragged across iron. He walked the line slowly, inspecting each recruit, and when he reached Alara, he stopped. He looked at her the way you look at a chair someone has placed in the middle of a hallway, something that clearly doesn't belong where it is. "Was," he said. "Yes, sir," she answered. "You know where you are?" "Yes, sir." "You know what this is?" "Yes, sir." He leaned closer, and his breath smelled like black tea and something bitter. "We'll see," he said, and moved on, the recruit standing beside her. A tall young man with red ears and a thick neck glanced sideways and whispered, "You won't make it past dinner." She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes straight ahead. But behind her back, where nobody could see, her hands were balled into fists so tight that her fingernails left marks in her palms. "Now let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. Have you ever been in a place where every single person around you wanted you to fail? Where every eye was waiting for you to break down, give up, and walk away? And yet something inside you, something you couldn't even name, kept you standing? If you have, I want you to tell me about it in the comments, because that is exactly where Alara was standing right now, and what comes next is going to test her in ways she never imagined. The first week at Ashimere was not designed to train you. It was designed to make you quit. They ran before sunrise, mile after mile through the cold morning darkness until their lungs burned and their legs felt like water. They drilled sword positions for hours, raising and lowering their arms until their shoulders screamed and their hands blistered. They stood at attention in the freezing courtyard while Brannock circled them like a hawk, watching for the smallest mistake, a foot that shifted, a chin that dropped, a breath that came out too loud. Alara's body had never been through anything like this. At night, her legs cramped so badly she had to press her face into her pillow to keep from crying out. Her blisters split open and bled through her gloves, and she washed them in cold water each evening and wrapped them with strips torn from her own undershirt, because she refused to go to the medical tent and give anyone a reason to say she wasn't strong enough. She went to sleep with her jaw clenched and woke up with her whole body aching, and she got up and did it all again. She told no one how much pain she was in, because she understood, with a clarity that went beyond words, what every person in that fortress was waiting for. They were waiting for her to break. Every instructor who pushed her harder than the others, every recruit who stared at her with open disbelief, every officer who watched from the edges of the courtyard with folded arms and skeptical faces, they were all waiting for the same moment. The moment she would cry or complain or ask for help or simply walk away. And she refused, absolutely refused, to give them that satisfaction. But the cruelty was not only physical. One evening, after a full day of drills that left her barely able to climb the stairs, Alara returned to her bunk and found her boots missing. She searched the barracks quietly, looking under beds and behind lockers, but they were gone. The next morning, she went to drill barefoot, her feet raw and red against the frozen stone. Brannock looked down at her feet and didn't ask what happened. He just said, "If you can't keep track of your equipment, Voss, maybe you're not ready to keep track of a kingdom." She stood there with numb toes and a burning face and said, "It won't happen again, sir." But it did happen again. Her bedroll was soaked with water. The word leave was carved deep into the wood of her locker. Her training sword was bent just slightly, just enough to throw off her balance during drills and make her look clumsy in front of the officers who were evaluating her. Someone wanted her gone, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make her leave on her own. Alara fixed everything without telling a soul. She dried her bedroll in the kitchen when no one was looking. She straightened her sword with a flat stone and 2 hours of patience. She slept on the bare floor when she had to, and she never once reported what was happening. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew exactly what would happen if she did. Complaining would become the only story they told about her. She couldn't handle it. She needed special treatment. She wasn't cut out for this. She refused to let that be her story. The only story she wanted them to tell was the simplest one of all. She stayed. By the 6th week, 18 recruits had dropped out. Several more had been dismissed for failing the endurance tests. The group that remained was smaller, harder, quieter, a collection of young men who had been shaped by exhaustion into something tougher than what they were when they arrived. And in the middle of that group, still standing, still silent, still showing up every morning before anyone else, was Alara. Something small had begun to change, although nobody talked about it openly. The recruit with the red ears, whose name was Harlan, had stopped whispering about her. He didn't speak to her either, but one morning, Alara found her boots placed neatly beside her bed, cleaned and polished. She looked across the barracks and saw Harlan sitting on his own bunk, lacing up his own boots, his eyes down, his face completely blank. Neither of them said a word, but something had shifted between them, something quiet and careful, like the first crack in a frozen river. And then came the Stone March. Every recruit at Ashimir knew about it. Every recruit dreaded it. 40 miles across open terrain in full gear, and the final 5 miles carrying your assigned partner on your back. It was the trial that ended careers. Strong, capable men who had passed every other test came back from the Stone March with something broken behind their eyes, something that had nothing to do with their legs. Alara was paired with Harlan. They set out at dawn, when the air was so cold you could see your breath hanging in front of you like small ghosts. Harlan walked ahead without looking back. Alara followed without complaint. Mile after mile, they moved in silence through muddy trails and open fields, their packs digging into their shoulders, their legs growing heavier with every step. By mile 15, 2 recruits from other pairs had collapsed and been carried off on stretchers. By mile 25, Alara's vision was blurring at the edges, and she could feel every single blister, every bruise, every sleepless night of the past 6 weeks pressing down on her body all at once. But she kept walking. At mile 35, Harlan stepped wrong on a patch of loose rock. There was a sound, sharp and sudden, like a branch snapping, and then he was on the ground, his face twisted, both hands gripping his right leg. He tried to push himself up. His knee buckled, and he went down again, hard, his palms scraping against the gravel. He lay there, breathing through his teeth, his face white and slick with sweat. He looked up at her. His lips moved, and at first nothing came out. Then, quietly, with the kind of honesty that only comes when pride has been stripped away by pain, he said, "You can't carry me, Alara. I'm twice your weight. Just go. Finish the march. You've earned it." Alara looked at him. She looked at the trail ahead, stretching out into the gray distance. She looked at her own hands, blistered and raw and shaking with exhaustion. Every part of her body was begging her to walk away, to finish alone, to save herself. Instead, she knelt down beside him. She pulled a strip of cloth from her sleeve, the same way she had been wrapping her own wounds for weeks, and tied it firmly around his swollen knee. She looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I'm not going to carry you. You're going to put your arm over my shoulder, and we're going to walk out of here together. One step at a time." "Alara, I can't." "One step." He stared at her, and something moved behind his eyes, something that wasn't gratitude yet, something closer to confusion, like he was truly seeing her for the first time after 6 weeks of standing right beside her. He put his arm over her shoulder, and they started walking. What happened over the next 5 hours on that gravel road, and what was waiting for them at the end of it, would change everything. 5 hours. That is how long it took them to walk those last 5 miles. 5 hours of Harlan's weight pressing down on Alara's shoulders, his arm draped across her back, his body leaning into hers with every step because his right leg could no longer hold him. 5 hours of gravel crunching under her boots while fire spread through her spine, and her knees trembled and her vision blurred in and out like a candle flame caught in the wind. They didn't talk much during those hours. There wasn't enough breath left for talking. Alara focused on the ground in front of her, on the next stone, the next patch of dirt, the next step. That was the only way to survive something like this, she realized. You couldn't think about the finish line. You couldn't think about how far you still had to go. You could only think about the next step. Just one. And then one more after that. Harlan tried to pull away twice. The first time, about an hour in, he shifted his weight and said, "This isn't fair to you." Alara tightened her grip on his arm and kept walking. She didn't answer because she didn't have the breath to waste on arguing with him. The second time, nearly 3 hours later, her left knee buckled and she went down hard, landing on one knee on the gravel path. The impact sent a shock of pain through her whole body, and for a moment the world tilted sideways and she couldn't tell which way was up. Harlan pulled his arm free and sat down on the ground beside her. His face was gray. His hands were shaking. "Alara, listen to me," he said, and his voice was raw and cracked. "Leave me here. You can send someone back for me. Just go. Please." She stayed on one knee, breathing hard, her head hanging forward, sweat dripping from her forehead onto the gravel. Her arms were shaking. Her back felt like it was being torn apart from the inside. Every muscle, every bone, every nerve in her body was screaming at her to stop, to lie down on this path and close her eyes and let it be over. And in that moment, with her face pointed toward the ground and her body ready to quit, she saw something. Not with her eyes. Deeper than that. She saw her mother. Not sitting by the fire with the pendant. Not lying in bed during those last 9 days. She saw Sarah in the ravine, 20 years ago, in the middle of the night, waist deep in black water that was rising fast, with a wounded man on her back who was too heavy for her to carry, but she carried him anyway. She saw her mother's face in the darkness, jaw tight, eyes burning, legs pushing forward against the current, when every part of her body had already given up. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Alara put her hand on the ground and pushed herself back up. Her knee screamed. Her back screamed louder. She stood there, swaying slightly, and looked down at Harlan with eyes that were red and wet but absolutely steady. "Get up," she said. He looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Get up, Harlan." He stared at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, painfully, using her shoulder as a support, he pulled himself to his feet. He put his arm back across her shoulders. She braced herself against his weight, and they started walking again. The sun was low in the sky and turning everything orange and gold when they finally saw the fortress walls ahead of them. The courtyard gates were open. Figures stood near the entrance, watching. Alara couldn't make out their faces because her vision had narrowed to a tunnel, but she could see the gray stone of the courtyard, and she knew that if she could just reach it, the gravel would end and it would be over. 10 more steps. She counted them. Each one felt like lifting a boulder with her legs. 9, 8. Her boots hit the edge of the courtyard stone. 7, 6. Harlan's breathing was rough and shallow beside her ear. 5, 4. Her left leg buckled again, and this time she couldn't catch herself. 3, 2. They went down together, right there on the cold courtyard stone, a tangle of arms and legs and exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. Alara lay on her back, staring up at the gray sky, her chest heaving, her hands open and trembling at her sides. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. But they had crossed the line. Dead last, hours behind everyone else, but they had crossed it. She heard boots approaching. Heavy, steady steps that she recognized even through the fog of exhaustion. Brannick. He stood over them for what felt like a very long time, looking down at the two of them lying on the stone like they had just washed up on a shore after a shipwreck. His face was hard to read, the way it always was. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. But then he spoke, and the words he said were words Alara would remember for the rest of her life. "Well done, Voss." 2 words. That was all. No ceremony, no speech, no fanfare. Just 2 words from a man who had never once shown her anything but coldness. And yet those 2 words landed in her chest like a key turning in a lock she didn't even know was there. Something opened inside her, something small and warm, and for the first time since she arrived at Ashimir, she felt like maybe she wasn't just surviving this place. Maybe she was actually becoming part of it. Later, after the medics had taken Harlan to the medical bench and wrapped his knee in ice and bandages, Alara sat on the courtyard steps with a cup of water she could barely hold because her hands were still shaking. The other recruits who had finished the march earlier were in the dining hall, eating and talking in low voices. She was alone. The courtyard was quiet. The last light of the day was fading behind the fortress walls. And then she felt someone watching her. She looked up and saw Harlan sitting on the medical bench across the courtyard, maybe 30 feet away. His leg was propped up on a wooden crate. His face was still drawn with pain, but he was looking straight at her, and as their eyes met, he did something that she did not expect. He raised his right fist, slowly, and pressed it against the center of his chest. He held it there, the old salute, not the formal one they taught in training, the stiff, mechanical gesture you performed when an officer walked past. This was different. This was the salute soldiers gave to each other, the one that meant something that couldn't be put into words, the one that said, "You carried me when I couldn't walk, and I will never forget it." Alara's throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She didn't cry, not quite, but it was close. She nodded once, slowly, and that was enough. That was everything. That night, lying on her bunk in the dark barracks, she held the iron pendant against her chest and closed her eyes. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were raw. Her back felt like it had been bent in half and put back together wrong. But something inside her felt different. Lighter, maybe, or heavier, but in a good way, like she was finally carrying something that actually belonged to her instead of just surviving the weight of things that didn't. She whispered into the darkness, so quietly that even if someone had been standing right beside her, they wouldn't have heard it. "I'm still here, Mama." And then she slept, deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in 6 weeks. The morning of the presentation arrived with frost on the courtyard stones that caught the early light and made everything look like it was covered in broken glass. The air was sharp and cold, and the sky was pale, and there was a feeling in the fortress that Alara had never felt before, a kind of heaviness, like the whole building was holding its breath. Every surviving recruit had been told to report to the Great Hall at 9 o'clock. They had been given their dress uniforms the night before, red tunics with gold trim, white belts, dark trousers, and the tall black bearskin hats that were the symbol of the Royal Guard. Alara had laid hers out on her bunk the previous evening and stared at it for a long time before touching it, because it looked like something that belonged to someone else, someone who had already proven themselves, someone who had already been accepted. She wasn't sure she was that person yet, but she put it on anyway. She buttoned the tunic carefully, straightened the gold trim, fastened the white belt around her waist, and pinned the 3 small medals she had earned during the trials to the left side of her chest. There weren't many medals, but each one had cost her something real, something that couldn't be measured in metal. She pulled on her boots, the same boots that had been stolen and returned, that had carried her through 40 miles of gravel and mud and pain. She placed the bearskin hat on her head. It was heavy. It pressed down on her dark hair and sat firm against her skull, and the weight of it felt like both a burden and a crown. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall beside her bunk. The woman staring back at her looked different from the girl who had arrived at Ashenmere 6 weeks ago with a folded application and shaking hands. This woman's face was thinner, her jaw was harder, and her eyes had something in them that hadn't been there before. A kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from having walked through fire and come out the other side. She tucked the iron pendant inside her tunic, against her skin, where she could feel it resting above her heart. And then she walked out of the barracks and into the cold morning air. The Great Hall of Ashenmere was the oldest part of the fortress. The doors were massive, made of dark wood reinforced with iron bands, and when they swung open, the air that came out smelled like centuries, old stone and candle wax and the faint iron tang of armor that had been polished 1,000 times. Alara stepped through the doorway and stopped. She had never been inside this room before, and nothing could have prepared her for it. The ceiling rose so high above her that it disappeared into shadow, lost somewhere in the darkness above the reach of the torchlight. The walls were made of pale gray stone, thick and ancient, and they were lined with dark banners that hung from iron rods near the ceiling. Each banner was embroidered with gold thread and patterns that caught the flickering light of the torches mounted along the walls, and they seemed to glow with a life of their own, shifting and shimmering as the flames moved. At the far end of the hall, a bright light poured in from somewhere behind the raised platform, maybe a tall window or an open doorway, and it cast long, dramatic shadows across the stone floor. And standing in 2 perfect rows along the center aisle, 1 row on each side, were the Royal Guard. Alara felt her breath catch in her throat. They were magnificent and terrifying at the same time. Each guard stood in full-plate armor, polished silver that reflected the torchlight like mirrors. Each one had a sword sheathed at his side. Each one wore the tall black bearskin hat, the same kind she now wore on her own head, and their faces beneath those hats were serious and still, the faces of men who had stood in this hall many times before and who had long ago stopped being impressed by anything. There must have been 40 of them, 20 on each side, forming a corridor of silver and shadow that led from the doorway all the way to the raised platform at the back of the hall. They did not move. They did not blink. They stood like statues carved from steel and silence, and the only sound in the entire hall was the soft hiss and crackle of the torches burning on the walls. Alara took a breath, and then she walked forward. Her boots sounded against the stone floor with each step, and the sound echoed through the hall in a way that made her feel both enormous and tiny at the same time. She could feel the eyes of the armored guards on her as she passed between them, could feel their attention like a physical weight pressing against her from both sides. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her back straight. She kept walking until she reached the center of the hall, directly beneath the largest banner, and there she stopped and stood at attention. The other surviving recruits filed in behind her and took their positions in rows near the entrance. She could hear them shuffling into place, the soft rustle of uniforms and the careful placement of boots on stone. And then they too went still, and the hall fell into a silence so complete that Alara could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. For a long moment, nothing happened. The torches burned. The banners glowed. The armored guards stood like monuments on either side of her. And Alara waited, her hands folded behind her back, the pendant warm against her skin beneath the tunic. Then she heard it, a sound from the back of the hall, the sound of boots on stone, but not the quick, sharp sound of someone walking with purpose. This was slow, measured, deliberate, the sound of someone who knew that every eye and ear in the room was focused on them and who understood exactly what that meant. She looked toward the raised platform at the far end of the hall, and she saw him, Supreme Commander Aldrich Thorn. He stood on the platform, elevated above everyone else, dressed in a red uniform with gold medals across his chest and a bearskin hat on his head. His face was made of hard lines and deep decisions, the face of a man who had been in command for over 20 years and who carried the weight of that command in every muscle and every bone. He was not young, but he was not frail either. He was the kind of man who looked like he had been carved from the same stone as the fortress itself, solid and enduring and impossible to move. He descended 3 steps, one at a time, slowly, each boot landing on the stone with a sound that seemed to push the silence even deeper, if that was possible. The armored guards on both sides of the aisle did not move, did not turn their heads, but Alara could feel the room tightening around her, as if everyone in it was being pulled toward the same point. Thorn reached the bottom of the steps and walked toward her. His pace was unhurried. His eyes were fixed on her face. He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough that she could see the individual threads in the gold trim on his uniform, close enough that she could see the way the torchlight moved across his features, revealing and then hiding the deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He studied her, not the way Brannick had studied her on that first morning, like something out of place. This was different. Thorn was looking at her the way you look at a photograph of someone you used to know, searching for something familiar, something you remember but haven't seen in a very long time. "Voss," he said. "Yes, sir." His jaw moved slightly, a small, tight motion, like he was working something loose that had been stuck for years. He looked away from her for a moment, toward the far wall, toward nothing. And when he looked back, his eyes were different. The authority was still there, the steadiness, the command. But underneath all of it, like water running beneath ice, there was something raw and human and unguarded. "Your mother," he said. "Your mother was Sarah Voss, from Briarton." Alara felt her heart slam against her ribs. Her hands, still folded behind her back, went cold. She swallowed hard and said, "Yes, sir." Thorn nodded. It was a slow nod, the kind that doesn't mean agreement but acknowledgement, the kind that says, "I have been waiting a very long time for this moment." "I knew her," he said, and then, quieter, almost to himself, "I knew her." The hall was so silent that Alara could hear the torches breathing on the walls. 40 armored guards, 20 recruits, officers along the sides of the room, all of them watching this exchange between the most powerful man in the Royal Guard and a young woman from a town nobody had ever heard of, and none of them understanding what was happening. Thorn took a breath. It was the first time Alara had seen him do anything that looked even remotely uncertain. "I was there," he said, "at the ravine." Alara's breath stopped. "I was one of the 11. The words hit her like a wave. Not a violent wave, not the kind that knocks you off your feet, but the deep, slow kind that rises up from somewhere far beneath the surface and lifts you off the ground before you even realize it's happening. She felt the floor shift under her boots, felt the hall grow larger and smaller at the same time, felt something crack open in her chest that she had been keeping sealed for years. Thorn reached into the inner pocket of his coat. His hand moved slowly, carefully, the way you move when you're handling something that cannot be replaced. He withdrew his hand, and in it he held a small object that caught the torchlight and glowed dully against his palm. It was a pendant, made of iron, dark and scratched, shaped like a small shield. Alara's vision blurred. Her throat closed. She knew that pendant the way she knew her own name. She knew every scratch, every groove, every dent on its surface. She had held it 1,000 nights by the fire. She had pressed it against her chest in the dark when the loneliness was so thick she could barely breathe. She had placed it on her mother's headstone the morning she left for Ashenmere, whispering, "I'll earn my own." But here it was, not on the headstone. Here, in this hall, in the hand of a man whose life her mother had saved in a flooded ravine 20 years ago. "She gave this to me," Thorn said, and his voice was steady but thin, stretched tight like a wire that could snap at any moment. "That night, after she pulled me out of the water, she pressed it into my hand and she said something I have never forgotten." He paused, and for just a moment, his eyes glistened in the torchlight. He blinked it away quickly, the way old soldiers do, but everyone in that hall saw it. She said, "If anyone from my blood ever comes to serve, give this back to them. They'll know what it means." He held the pendant out toward Alara. She looked at it. Her mother's pendant. The only piece of Sarah Voss that had survived the silence, the erasure, the decades of forgetting. It sat in Thorn's open palm, dark and small and impossibly heavy with everything it represented. Alara reached for it. Her fingers were trembling so badly she was afraid she would drop it. When she closed her hand around the iron, it was warm. Not cold, not the temperature of metal that has been sitting in a pocket. Warm, genuinely warm, as if it had been held close to someone's heart for a very long time, because it had. For 20 years, Aldrich Thorn had carried Sarah's pendant against his chest, waiting for this moment, carrying a debt he could never repay to a woman the world had chosen to forget. And that was when the wall inside Alara finally broke. It didn't break loudly. It didn't break with a sob or a cry or a dramatic collapse. It broke the way dawn breaks over a dark horizon. Slowly at first, just a thin line of light, and then all at once, flooding everything. Her chin trembled. Her eyes filled. One tear slid down her cheek and fell onto the stone floor between her boots, and she did not wipe it away because she was not ashamed of it. That tear was not weakness. That tear was 6 years of grief and loneliness and stubborn, relentless love finally finding its way to the surface. Thorn watched her. His own jaw was tight, his own eyes bright with something he was fighting to keep inside. He stood there, this powerful man, the supreme commander of the Royal Guard, and for a moment he was not a commander at all. He was just a man who owed his life to a woman the world had thrown away, standing in front of that woman's daughter, trying to find a way to make it right. He turned to face the assembled hall. When he spoke, his voice was strong again, carrying to every corner of that ancient room, reaching the farthest guard and the last recruit and the highest stone in the highest wall. 20 years ago, he said, a woman saved my life. She saved the lives of 10 other men. She crossed enemy lines 14 times. She carried the wounded through a ravine in the dark while the water tried to pull her under. She did this not for glory, not for rank, not for recognition. She did it because it needed to be done, and she was the one willing to do it. He paused. The silence in the hall was so deep it had a sound of its own, like the inside of a seashell pressed against your ear. When the conflict ended, he continued, the crown erased her service. They told her it would be complicated to acknowledge what she had done. They gave her a pension and told her to go home and be quiet. They told her that she never happened. His voice tightened on those last 3 words, and Alara could hear the anger in it. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, heavy kind that comes from carrying something wrong inside you for 2 decades and never being able to set it down. I followed those orders, Thorn said. I stayed quiet. I let them erase her, and I have carried that shame every day since. It is the heaviest thing I have ever carried, heavier than any armor, any sword, any duty I have ever been given. And I will carry it until I die. He turned back to Alara. His eyes were clear now, steady, focused with the kind of purpose that changes the air in a room. But today, he said, we begin to make it right. He raised his hand, and from the side of the hall, an aide stepped forward carrying something that looked very old. It was a leather scroll, cracked at the edges, the kind of object you could tell had not been touched in a very long time. The wax seal on it had turned dark, almost black, like dried blood. Thorn took the scroll and held it up so the entire hall could see it. This, he said, is the decree of open service. It was written into the founding charter of this kingdom 300 years ago, at the very beginning, when the first stones of this fortress were being laid. It states that any citizen of this kingdom, any citizen, who demonstrates loyalty, skill, and courage, may serve the crown. He paused. The silence pressed in from every direction. Regardless of birth, he said. Regardless of name. He broke the seal. The old wax crumbled and fell to the stone floor in small dark pieces. Regardless of gender, he unrolled the scroll. The parchment was yellowed and fragile, but the words written on it were clear, and Thorn read them aloud in a voice that did not shake, that filled every corner of the great hall, that reached back through 300 years of silence and pulled something forgotten and buried into the light where it belonged. When he finished reading, the silence that followed was unlike anything Alara had ever experienced. It was not empty. It was full, packed tight with the weight of what had just happened, with the understanding that something very old and very wrong had just been undone in this room, in front of these witnesses, and that it could never be put back. Thorn rolled the scroll closed and handed it back to the aide. Then he looked at Alara, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter now, but somehow it carried even farther than before, as if the hall itself was leaning in to listen. "You are not only accepted into the royal guard Voss," he said. "You are appointed to the king's inner detail. Effective immediately." Alara felt the words land in her chest, one by one, like stones dropping into still water. "You will stand where your mother should have stood," Thorn continued. "And your name, both your names, will be entered into the official record of service. Permanently. No one will ever erase them again." Alara couldn't speak. Her throat was closed tight, and her hand was pressed so hard against the pendant inside her fist that the edges of the iron were cutting into her palm. But she straightened her back. She lifted her chin. And she looked at Supreme Commander Aldrich Thorn with the same eyes her mother must have had in that ravine, steady and fierce and full of something that could not be silenced, not by orders, not by tradition, not by 20 years of forgetting. Thorn held her gaze, and then he did something that no one in that hall had ever seen before, something that no Supreme Commander had done for a recruit in the entire 300-year history of the Royal Guard. He saluted her first. He raised his right fist and pressed it against his chest, over his heart, and he held it there. Not the formal salute of rank and ceremony. The old one. The real one. The one that soldiers gave to each other when words were not enough, when what had been earned could not be measured or named or written down. He held it, and he did not look away. The sound that followed was not applause. It was something deeper than applause, something that came from a place that applause could never reach. It started with the guard nearest to Alara on her left. He raised his armored fist and struck it against his silver breastplate. A single, sharp crack of metal on metal that echoed off the stone walls like a heartbeat. And then the guard beside him did the same. And the next. And the next. One by one, down both rows, 40 armored men raising their fists and striking them against their chests. And the sound built and built and built until it filled the entire hall, until it bounced off the ceiling and the floor and the ancient banners on the walls, until it sounded like thunder, like the hall itself was beating with a single enormous heart. Alara stood at the center of it. Tears were running freely down her face, and she did not wipe them away. She stood with her back straight and her chin lifted and her mother's pendant pressed against her palm, and she let the sound wash over her like a wave, like a flood, like the water in a ravine that had tried to pull her mother under 20 years ago but couldn't, because Sarah Voss was stronger than the current, stronger than the silence, stronger than a world that tried to pretend she had never existed. In the second row of recruits, near the back of the hall, Harlan stood on his injured knee. It must have hurt, standing like that, with his weight on a leg that had given out on a gravel road 2 days earlier. But he stood, because she had refused to leave him on that road, and he would not sit down in this moment. His face was wet. He didn't try to hide it. He raised his fist and pressed it against his chest, and he held it there, and his eyes never left hers. The sound of armored fists on breastplates echoed through the great hall for a long time. It went on, wave after wave, and Alara stood in the middle of it and felt something she had not felt since she was 12 years old. sitting by the fire while her mother told her about the bravest thing she had ever done. She felt seen, not watched, not stared at, not judged or measured or tested. Seen. The way her mother had been seen by 11 men in a ravine in the dark. The way Sarah should have been seen by the crown, by the kingdom, by history. The way every person deserves to be seen when they have given everything they have and asked for nothing in return. The sound finally faded. The last echo died against the far wall, and the hall settled back into silence. But it was a different silence now. It was warm. It was full. It was the silence that comes after something has been completed, after a wrong has been made right, after a promise has been kept. Thorn lowered his fist. He looked at Alara one last time, and something passed between them that neither of them would ever be able to describe. It was not a word. It was not a gesture. It was just a knowing, deep and quiet, the understanding that they were connected by a woman who was no longer alive but who was more present in that room than anyone standing in it. He turned and walked back toward the platform. His boots sounded against the stone, steady and measured, and the ceremony continued with the other recruits. Names called, positions assigned, the formal business of building a guard. But everyone in that hall knew that what had just happened was not formal business. What had just happened was something else entirely. That evening, long after the ceremony had ended and the hall had emptied and the torches had burned down to low, orange stubs, Alara walked back inside alone. The great hall was different in the near darkness. The banners hung still and quiet in the cool air. The armor stands along the walls cast long shadows that stretched across the floor like sleeping giants. The light that had poured in from the back of the hall during the ceremony was gone now, replaced by the soft, uneven glow of the remaining torches, and the room felt smaller, more intimate, like a church after everyone has gone home. Alara walked to the center of the hall, to the exact spot where she had stood. She could still feel it in her boots, the particular smoothness of that stone, worn by centuries of feet that had stood in the same place for the same reason. She knelt down. She reached inside her tunic and pulled out the pendant. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, its warmth, the familiar grooves and scratches that she knew as well as the lines on her own palms. And then she placed it on the stone floor in front of her, gently, the way you set down something precious that you have been carrying for a very long time. She pressed both hands over it. She closed her eyes. "I didn't let them erase me, Mama," she whispered. Her voice was small in that vast, empty hall, but it was steady. Steady the way Sarah's voice had been steady by the fire. Steady the way it had been steady in the ravine. "And I brought your name back." Her voice broke on the last word. She stayed there on her knees on the cold stone, with her hands over the pendant and her eyes closed. The torchlight flickered across her red cloak and made the gold trim on her tunic glow softly. The shadows around her were gentle, not threatening, not pressing in, just there, keeping her company the way shadows do when you are alone in a room that holds a lot of memories. And somewhere in that silence, in the space between the stones and the darkness and the fading warmth of the torches, she felt something. Not a sound, not a voice, not anything she could point to or name or explain to another person. Just a feeling, a warmth, presence, like a hand resting softly on her shoulder, like someone standing behind her, close enough to touch, looking down at her with eyes full of love and pride and the quiet, unshakable certainty that comes from knowing your child has become everything you hoped they would be. Like someone saying, without any words at all, "I always knew you would." Alara stayed there for a long time. She didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. She just knelt on the stone floor of the great hall of Ashenmere, in the fortress that had tried to break her, in the room where she had been honored, wearing the uniform of the royal guard with her mother's pendant under her hands and her mother's memory in her heart. And for the first time in 6 years, she was not alone. The next morning, while Alara was putting on her uniform in the barracks, an officer knocked on the door and handed her a sealed envelope. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to the Royal Guard Recruitment Office. But someone had thought she should see it. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. An application form neatly filled out, from a 20-year-old woman in a small coastal town far from Ashenmere, far from Brighton, far from the great hall and the ceremony and the sound of armored fists on silver breastplates. Alara's eyes moved to the bottom of the form, to the small space marked "Reason for Applying." The young woman had written just one line, in careful handwriting that leaned slightly to the right, as if the words were reaching toward something they could almost touch. "Because Alara Voss showed me it was possible." Alara read those words 3 times. She pressed the paper against her chest, right over the spot where the pendant rested beneath her tunic. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath, and when she opened them again, they were wet, but she was smiling, because this was how it worked. This was how it had always worked. Not with grand speeches or ancient decrees or ceremonies in stone halls, although those things mattered. It worked like this: one woman standing up so that the next one could see that standing was possible. One life lived with courage so that another life could find the courage to begin. Pendant passed from hand to hand. A story told by firelight. Promise kept. Sarah Voss had stood in a ravine in the dark and carried men to safety on her back, and the world had tried to forget her. But the world had failed because Sarah had done something the world could not undo. She had told her daughter the truth, and her daughter had carried that truth all the way to the place where it could finally be heard. Alara folded the application carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her tunic, next to the pendant, next to her heart. She straightened her uniform. She placed the bearskin hat on her head. She looked at herself one more time in the small, cracked mirror on the barracks wall, and the woman who looked back at her was not the same woman who had arrived at Ashenmere 6 weeks ago with shaking hands and a folded piece of paper. This woman stood taller, not because she had grown, but because she had stopped bending. She walked out of the barracks and into the morning light, and the soldiers in the courtyard turned to look at her, and this time not a single one of them laughed. And somewhere, in a small cottage in Briarton, a rosemary plant was still growing in the garden behind the house where a seamstress had once lived. Nobody tended it anymore, but it grew anyway, stubborn and green, reaching toward the light the way living things do when they have roots that go deep enough. The way Sarah had taught it to, the way Alara always would. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.